I hope to get this all done in about 30 minutes to leave lots of time for question and answer at the end, because frankly, I think that's the most interesting part. But first, as Megan mentioned, I'm the legal director of the Global Justice Center, an international human rights organization that is dedicated to achieving gender equality through the rule of law. And we combine legal analysis with strategic advocacy to ensure equal protection for the law for women and girls. And a major component of this work focuses on accountability for sexual and gender-based violence. And a big component of that work focuses on bringing a gender perspective to the commission and response to mass atrocity crimes, including genocide. And in the early years of this project, we noticed a critical gap in how basically everybody thinks about genocide, including lawyers and legal scholars to diplomats and policymakers and academics and the general public. And specifically, what we saw was how gendered experiences of genocide, from its earliest stages to its prosecution, are overwhelmingly left out. So in December 2018, we partnered with the very brilliant lawyer and feminist Sarita Ashworth and published a white paper entitled Beyond Killing: Gender, Genocide, and Obligations Under International Law, which lays out our analysis for how gender needs to inform the legal framework of genocide. And in reflecting in my talk today, I went back to the fundamental premise of this paper, which is that gender, though not explicitly included in the Genocide Convention, is integral to the ways that genocide is planned and carried out. And this is in some ways obvious, as genocide is a crime that's focused on the destruction of a group, including on its ability to regenerate. But still, the different ways that members of a target group experience genocide on account of their gender is often ignored. So for example, during episodes of genocidal violence, men and older boys are generally targeted as the consequence of the gender roles that they are seen to inhabit. So they're attacked because they're seen as head of households, or as leaders, or as religious authorities, or protectors, potential combatants, guardians of a group identity, or as patriarchs. And the ways that they are attacked reflect that identity that they are perceived to have. On the other hand, attacks on women and girls are typically rooted in the roles that they are seen to inhabit, rather. And that's the roles as wives, or as mothers, or as daughters, or bearers of future life, keepers of the community and family honor, or sources of labor within the home. So in other words, what it means to be a male or a female in a particular society saturates perpetrators' conceptions of their victims and of the perpetrators themselves. And the violence directed against women and girls during genocide is fed by existing misogynies in society. However, since its inception, genocide has largely been understood as a crime committed through organized mass killing, the majority of victims of which, both historically and today, tend to be male. So consequently, the four non-killing acts of genocide, which are more likely to be directed against female members of a protected group, are not seen as being a part of the continuum of genocidal violence. And because of that, they're not recognized as signs of impending or ongoing genocide, and not indicted as genocide in any prosecutions that follow. And this narrow construction of genocide as being limited to killing obscures how lethal and non-lethal acts work together in a coordinated strategy aimed at destroying the protected group. It misses why perpetrators choose to target members of a protected group in diverse ways, beyond merely just killing, and why the resulting gender-specific harms continues the act of destruction long after the killings are over. So an overemphasis on killing as the privileged act of genocide has undercut the development of effective frameworks for prevention and prosecution of genocide. So I'll now go into a brief description of the relationship of gender to genocidal acts. And like I mentioned, genocide is composed of any or combination of 5 acts coupled with a specific intent to destroy a protected group. And those 5 acts are killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. Gender informs how each of these 5 acts are carried out, and I'll briefly talk about each one. Just keeping track of my notes here. So starting with killing, which, as I noted, is disproportionately affects men and boys, especially early on in genocides. The disproportionate impact is on men and boys is in and of itself a reflection of the gendered nature of killing. Fast killings of men and boys, typically through execution-style murders in the early or onset stages of genocide, relies on their perceived occupation of roles and responsibilities of public power and their roles in public life. But gender is also apparent in how women and girls are killed in genocide. So, for example, during the Yazidi genocide, while women and girls of childbearing age were abducted and sold into sexual slavery, older women who were past childbearing age were immediately killed, evincing the highly patriarchal notion that, according to ISIS, a woman's worth was tied to her ability to bear children. Or in another example, the Rwandan genocide, where sexual violence was actually the method of killing women and girls. And during these killings, perpetrated targeted sexual and reproductive organs for mutilation, showing the extreme misogyny of the genocidaires and their need to humiliate and diminish women and girls as a part of their broader genocidal campaign. Similarly, in the Rohingya genocide, in that genocide, men were overwhelmingly summarily shot, whereas Rohingya women and girls were often murdered by being burned alive or butchered with knives that are used for slaughtering animals. These methods, the methods that women were subjected to, are more typical of how the community destroys objects or property, demonstrating the military's deep misogyny and their very gendered conceptions of power. The next genocidal act is causing serious bodily and mental harm, which may constitute rape or other forms of sexual violence, torture and other cruel and human degrading treatment, deportation, forcible transfer, and enslavement. And of course, the landmark precedent in this case was the Rwanda Tribunal, or the landmark precedent of this act was the Rwanda Tribunal's Akiyesu case, which found that sexual violence was a step in the destruction of the Tutsi group, and that it was destruction of the spirit, of the will to live, and of life itself. And most genocidal campaigns have either explicitly or implicitly sanctioned sexual violence, including in Armenia, in Rwanda, in the former Yugoslavia, in Sudan, in Iraq, in Myanmar, and now potentially in Xinjiang, in Tigray as well. And in these settings, sexual violence is both an assault on the victim, but also on the existence, the identity, and the cohesion of the target group. And this is because sexual violence is especially effective when it's used in strongly patriarchal cultures, where protection of female members of the group is seen to be the ultimate responsibility of the group's male relative, of the female's male relatives. So in this way, sexual violence against a group's female members is often seen to be and is meant to be a means of a deliberate attack on the group's men. And to be more specific, an attack on the gendered roles that the men in the group are expected to play. And importantly, sexual violence, while the most accepted act of causing serious bodily or mental harm, is not the only act, and it's not the only way to commit this act in a gendered manner. For instance, very many different acts of torture can constitute causing serious bodily and mental harm, such as when the Yazidi and Rohingya females were forced to watch the murder of their relatives, or when Yazidi mothers were forced to witness their daughters being sold into slavery, or when Tutsi women were forced to kill their sons in order to save the life of the other of their family members. Third, the third genocidal act is deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction. This act has not really been a major part of the prosecution of genocides in the past. And so it's still somewhat opaque in its scope, but it's generally understood to include things like subjecting the protected group to a subsistence diet, systemic expulsion from homes, and reduction of medical care below a minimum requirement. And this act is very much a reflection of the crimes that occurred in Nazi concentration camps, and many parts of it are seen across genocides. But from a gendered perspective, this act should be expanded to include the realities that we know are brought upon women and girls in genocides, and specifically instances of sexual violence. So in the Rwandan genocide, the Interahamwe intentionally infected Tutsi women with HIV, knowing at the time that that was tantamount to a death sentence. It should also include situations wherein ISIS kept Yazidi women and girls in slavery with treatment that they could not survive in. But it should also include situations where survivors of sexual violence are at risk of violence or killing as a result of the sexual violence that was visited upon them by killing by their own group. So in other words, if a sexual violence means that a person becomes at risk of a so-called honor killing, that should fall within the rubric of conditions intended to destroy the group physically. Yet none of these acts have yet been considered as measures to destroy the group, largely because killing, if it's not killing, it doesn't fall within our prevailing model of what genocide is. The fourth act of the convention is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And this act really reflects the fixation of genocidaires on preventing the target group from regenerating through reproduction. And it has been from the outset presumed to be mainly concerned with women and girls. And that view that this act is the act for attacks on women and girls stems from a deeply held view that women are wombs and that they're the primary holders of reproductive power and responsibility in a society. And the court in Akiyesu listed a wide swath of measures that can constitute measures intended to prevent births, including rape, sexual mutilation, forced sterilization, forced birth control, separation of the sexes, prohibition of marriages, mental trauma resulting in reluctance to procreate. And of course, in theory, none of these assume that the victims are female, but in practice, that assumption has very much been made. So for example, in patrilineal cultures where the ethnic and religious identity of a child is passed down from the father, the very act of separating women from men, which we see across genocides, constitutes a measure to prevent births within a group. Of course, if a group's men and women can't procreate, there can't be a continuation of the group. But for much of the prosecutorial history of genocide, the killing of male members of the group, which is a type of permanent separation of the sexes, has not been analyzed as a method of preventing births within a group. That underscores the fact that men and boys are not typically seen as reproductive agents in the same way that women and girls are, and instead that men are seen as the bearers of the group identity and women are seen as being responsible for bearing that life. Finally, the last genocidal act is forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. And in the documentation of genocide, in the documentation of many international crimes, children are often referred to collectively without regard to their gender. Yet gender plays a very significant role in the experiences that children have in genocides. Women and girls, boys and girls, like women and men, experience genocide differently according to their gender. So in both the Armenian and the Yazidi genocides, children were taken from their families and forced into gendered roles by their aggressors. Boys were often taken into the fold of their perpetrator group. They were given Muslim names, they were forcibly converted to Islam, and they were used for labor or in some cases as child soldiers. Kidnapped girls, on the other hand, were not taken into the fold. They were treated much differently. They were treated in a manner that very much displays the misogyny of the perpetrators. There was no attempt to indoctrinate or otherwise purge the girls of their identity. And rather, in both the Armenian and the Yazidi genocide, girls were treated as chattel, as property, as slaves by those who captured them. So all this is to say, having gone through each of the acts, that what frequently comes to mind in genocide, that being a crime of mass killings, is off a bit. The conduct of genocide is extremely gendered, and so too must effective responses be. So in this context, I'll briefly discuss the two key obligations that result from the Genocide Convention, including the duty to prevent genocide and the duty to punish genocide. On the duty to prevent, the failure to acknowledge the role in gender in the planning and commission and impact of genocide has limited the international community's ability to recognize the warning signs of genocide and to properly recognize when genocide is happening. And in practice, these blind spots have been a boon to states. It's allowed states to blur the lines of whether or not a genocide is or is not happening. And that blurred line has allowed them to sidestep compliance with the convention when it's not convenient for these states politically. And like is the case with the commission of genocide, the limits on the prevention framework are rooted in the idea of killing as the privileged genocidal act. And as a result, genocide or pre-genocidal acts that are primarily affect women and girls are not seen as warning signs or is not seen as the crime itself. So take, for example, the UN framework of analysis for atrocity crimes, which sets out common risk factors for all mass atrocity crimes, but it also includes genocide. The purpose of this framework is to provide guidance on when mass atrocities might occur. And despite a detailed breakdown of dozens of risk factors, the framework fails to discuss how different violations might target male and female victims differently. There's no attempt to differentiate between how early warning signs might manifest differently in the form of gendered harms. And on top of it all, the language of the risk factors are imbued with very harmful gendered stereotypes. The framework continues a practice of grouping women with children, which infantilizes the women and bolsters the perception that women, though adults, require special protection that men belonging to the protected group don't need. The framework also doesn't consider the possibility of men being victims of sexual violence or the reality that men are reproductive agents of a protected group as well. And you can really see the failure of this framework again in the Yazidi example. You might remember early on that there was limited action to rescue the Yazidis who were trapped on Sinjar Mountain as ISIL was making its sweeps across northwestern Iraq. But the coalition action to stop genocide stopped there. So immediately after that, thousands of women and girls were waiting in northwestern Iraq to be registered and sold into slavery. But there was no international action taken by the international community to rescue them because it was not seen as genocide, which it very much was. And I should note that the duty to prevent doesn't only apply in the lead up or to an ongoing genocide, but if and where pre-existing structures of patriarchy, of gender domination, and gender violence contribute to genocidal violence or may contribute to genocidal violence, then preventative measures should focus on those misogynistic attitudes and should focus on the policies that underpin the treatment of human beings as objects, or that tolerates or incites or supports violence against women and girls or persons of the LGBTQ community in particular. So turning now to the prosecution of genocide, this is where a lot of the discourse on gender and genocide has happened. And much like our look at the commission and prevention of genocide, prosecutors have been more likely to charge genocide in situations where a mass killing has occurred, while situations where non-lethal acts of genocide are either not prosecuted at all or are prosecuted as war crimes and crimes against humanity. And again, these non-lethal acts are the ones that disproportionately affect women and girls. So while the non-lethal acts are no less serious, these view from the perpetrators casts the experiences of women outside the continuum of genocidal violence. And the Rwanda Tribunal's Akiyesu case is a very illustrative example of this. In that case, there was overwhelming evidence of sexual and gender-based violence, but that evidence did not amount to the bringing of charges. The prosecutor did not bring charges for sexual violence as a form of genocide. And in response, Rwandan women's rights groups advocated and petitioned the court for the indictment to be amended, which the trial court, which ultimately happened, the trial court granted. And it was on that basis that gave way to the first, one of the only convictions for sexual violence as genocide. So the landmark case, and unfortunately that groundbreaking precedent hasn't really been followed, but that landmark case was only possible because of civil society action, a little bit of judicial intervention, and forcing the space open for a gender perspective, which has yet to be followed up on. So instead of recognizing the ways in which women and girls, or the gendered ways in which the genocide is committed, because women are more likely to survive genocide prosecution and genocide trials rely heavily on what they have seen and heard and suffered. So that is the prevailing understanding of genocide as mass killing excludes the crimes committed directly against women and girls, but at the same time relies on them to bear witness to the killings of their fathers or their brothers or their sons or their husbands. And that's a harm in itself. And when prosecutorial decisions exclude substantial parts of the community of genocide victims, ironically, they end up participating in the types of erasure that the perpetrators intended in the first place. It also goes to distort the historical record that is, in theory, supposed to be borne out by the trials. So, in sum, the continuing failure to acknowledge the complexity of genocidal violence and the distinct ways in which genocide is planned and committed against men, women, boys, and girls by reason of their gender has undercut the development of an effective framework that we need to mobilize the international community to meet their obligations to prevent and punish genocide. Today, thousands of Yazidi women and girls are still missing. Rohingya women and girls, many of whom have been subject to horrific gender-based genocidal violence, are at risk of being repatriated to the site of the crimes and back into the hands of their perpetrators. Uyghur women are being forcibly sterilized by the thousands. Tigrayan women are experiencing unspeakable sexual violence. The failure to recognize and act on these as gender-based crimes of genocide infringes on the rights of these victims to be free from any and all forms of discrimination and to their right to equal protection before the law. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was such a fascinating presentation. We do have a few questions. I will encourage, if you would like to ask any questions out loud, you're welcome to raise your hand and I'll unmute your mic so that you can speak. But in the meantime, I will read some of our Q&A questions out loud and give you the opportunity to answer. So our first one is from Professor Alan Whitehorn. He's asking, in the separation of the sexes, while often initially stated as with the goal of isolating the potential soldiers, is this in large part also an attempt to break up the nuclear family structure?
I think that that would depend on the genocidal, the specific factual context, but I would be hard pressed to come up with an example where that isn't a factor in the separating of the sexes. And I think that there's certainly a component in that of targeting the social fabrics that a community uses to adhere itself to itself, and the family unit being one of them. And undertaking that separation, let's not forget that separation is often done in public, and that public aspect of the separation is intended to traumatize the group in a particular way in order to further the goal of destruction, of destroying the ties between the group, of the social fabric, of the, like I said, the strategies, for lack of a better phrase, the methods that the group uses to adhere to itself. So I'm reluctant to say that that's the case in every single genocide, but I like I said, I can't think of one off the top of my head where that wasn't an additional factor.
Great, thank you. And another question is, do conflicts just happen too quickly for a law to adapt, or does the international community not intend to update them?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I would say that, well, one, man, there's so many elements. I would say that genocides don't only happen in conflict. So it's not a situation of the rapid occurrence of internal or international armed conflict that triggers a genocide. And I think that the Xinjiang example is a good example of that arguably there's a very serious risk of genocide happening there, if not an actual genocide. And there's not. I don't know that anyone's arguing that there's an internal armed conflict. So it's not that. It's not that conflicts just develop too rapidly. A counterpoint would be, well, yeah, but do the conditions for the genocidal acts evolve too rapidly for the law to adapt? And I would argue that the law doesn't need to adapt. The law is quite good on, if you can look at the definition of the crime of the genocidal acts and take a gendered view of them and say, yeah, imposing conditions calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction should include things beyond forcible expulsion from homes and should include also instances of slavery or of sexual slavery. That's not, the law is completely round enough and robust enough to do that. It's just, frankly, I think gender discrimination in the view of those who enforce the law, and a general exclusion of women and girls in the experiences of mass atrocities well, generally in society. And so I think that it's the latter suggestion, that it's the reluctance of the international community is the more suitable answer. And while not a specifically gendered example per se, I would point to the well-documented response of the United States to the Rwandan genocide. And I can't remember what the citation is, but I do know that it's out there, that the Clinton administration was intentionally not calling it a genocide for fear of international obligations. There was a diplomatic cable sent. I can find the citation. It's in the Beyond Killing paper. But there's a diplomatic cable sent that we're refraining from calling it genocide because of the international obligations that then adhere. And you can see that all the time in potentially genocidal situations, and it's why, in theory, the U.S. State Department, for example, or the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs takes genocide designations so seriously, because if they do, if it is determined that there is an ongoing genocide or a serious risk of genocide, in theory, as a legal matter, there are all these things that the international community, that bearers of international responsibility under the Genocide Convention, are supposed to do to prevent and suppress that genocide. And that's laid out in the case law from the International Court of Justice, that states are supposed to take all measures within their power to prevent the genocide. And oftentimes states don't like to do those things because it's not in line with their political orientation. So there is an apprehension to embrace genocide as genocide where it's occurring in non-lethal ways, because it complicates the geopolitical factors that play into international relations. And so that's a big part of GJC's work. A big part of GJC's work is discrimination. I mean, leaving aside the human cost, that's gender discrimination, and that is frankly failing the international obligations that these states have under the Genocide Convention. So I think that you're right to point out that it's a reluctance on behalf of states. Your reluctance on behalf of states.
Thank you. And the next question is, do you think that there needs to be a separate genocide prevention approach to protect women and children? Could there be any downsides to this approach?
I don't think that that's necessary. And what I tried to do in the talk was not only discuss how a gendered view of genocide only means the inclusion of crimes committed against women and girls, but it also colors in how you understand crimes against men and boys as well. So, for instance, in the Genocidal Act of preventing births within a group, I pointed out that the killing of men is not seen as being a measure intended to prevent births within a group. But men are reproductive agents the same way that women are reproductive agents, though they don't carry that social responsibility in many protected group contexts, or in many contexts. So I don't think that you need a specific framework to protect women and children. And frankly, I think that grouping women and children like that as this separate, grouping women with children and treating children as children, fails to accommodate and approach the very nuanced ways that gender is integrated into genocidal and pre-genocidal campaigns. And so I think that really what would be more useful is for the UN framework for atrocity prevention, for instance, to include in its indicia, to include in its risk factors, certain of these gendered realities that we know that occur in any mass atrocity context, and then specifically to genocide. So in the framework, there's 12 risk factors, and I think 3 of them are dedicated. Well, certainly 2 of them are a little bit more genocide focused, and one of them is just straight up the intent to destroy. So I don't think there needs to be a specific prevention framework for genocide, and I don't think that it should be, any prevention framework should be grouping women with children, but instead should be looking at how gendered notions of power and what gender means to the perpetrators and the target population, and what those conceptions, what those understandings, what it means to be a male or a female in a particular group, how that might color in the types of conduct that the perpetrators utilize. So to use the Uyghur example, that's a classic example where, from what I understand, I should say I'm not an expert in the facts in the situation in Xinjiang, so I should tread softly. But from what I understand, there's been a wide-scale campaign of forced birth control and forcible sterilization, primarily against Uyghur women of childbearing age. There's been some, as I understand it, against men as well, but primarily it's been a campaign against women of childbearing age. That is, I think that you can make a gendered observation that is because within the community of perpetrators and within potentially the community of the victim population as well, that population that's being targeted for forcible sterilization is seen socially as the group that's responsible for reproduction. And so how do you be effective in ending reproduction? You target those seen as socially responsible for reproduction. And that is, and that type of gendered look can very much open up opportunities for how states understand genocide, where a risk of genocide is happening, measures that they should be taking in order to prevent the genocide, and so forth. So I think that's what I think.
No, that's great. Thank you. Someone else is asking, how is women's sexuality, when they're depicted as infiltrating racial purity, used against them in genocides?
Wow, can you read that again?
Yeah, so how is women's sexuality, and then in brackets, when they're depicted as infiltrating racial purity, used against them in genocides?
That's a very interesting question. I think that maybe what the person asking the question has in mind are examples from the Rwandan genocide. But I think that I think that it's certainly in that example, but also extending to in some ways the Rohingya as well, that the portrayal of women in a highly sexualized, the women of the target population are portrayed in a highly sexualized manner as temptresses, as individuals that are seeking to sully the bloodline of the perpetrating group, as in some ways as like racially or ethnically impure chaos agents, if you will. But at the same time, I also think, well, additionally, I think that beyond looking merely at, well, not merely, but beyond looking at women's sexuality, there's also a obsession and an obsession with the population and the encroachment of of victim populations. And so that's very much the case in the Rohingya genocide. The Rohingya have been subjected to very, very stringent and brutal restrictions to the freedom of movement, to their access to education, to their access to medical care, but also on their ability to form families in the way that they want. And that's because within Burma, the Rohingya are seen as a community that, if not managed, will overtake the ethnically Burmans, or that they have too many children, that there's this uncontrolled proliferation of the Rohingya group, and that stereotype and that sense of women as these agents of populating the persecuting group's country or borders with racially impure children is very much a narrative that you see across genocide. And so I think that's just slightly different than women's sexuality, but I think it's very related. And like I mentioned in the talk, across genocides, perpetrators are obsessed with the target group's regeneration and restricting that regeneration. And you find narratives of proliferation or perceived proliferation and risks of being overtaken and things like that across genocides. And that oftentimes has an element of misogyny, and as women as being responsible for parts of that.
Someone else is asking, as far as I know, research and discourse on gender and genocide focuses on the male-female experiences, but what about trans people or other LGBTQ members? Are they targeted in a specific way, or do they experience genocide differently than other groups?
That's extraordinarily important and great question. And you're right to notice that most of the discourse on gender and genocide is on female, well, on the binary, and that's a major gap. That's a major gap in the discourse, in the scholarship, in the case law. I think that a gendered understanding of the convention and of the crime is not preclusive of acknowledging and bringing in, and necessarily bringing in, the experiences of people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. But I think there remains a lot to be done. One encouraging example of that was in the context of the Rohingya genocide. The UN mandated, the Human Rights Council mandated fact-finding mission for Myanmar produced several remarkable reports. And one of them was dedicated specifically to sexual and gender-based violence occurring in several parts of Myanmar, but in Rakhine State as a part of the genocide as well. And in that report, they specifically addressed the experiences of transgender persons. And that was, to my knowledge, the first, well, I should be careful, I'm not sure. But that was a very important inclusion on the part of the FFM. And they didn't necessarily bring it within the context of the genocidal violence, and that's more of a technical reason because of timeline issues, but they did include it in the general articulation of sexual and gender-based violence on the part of the Myanmar military as being widespread, systematic, and brought upon different members of the target populations in different ways according to their gender identity and sexual orientation. So I think that the person asking the question is very right to highlight that the experiences of not only men and women, cis men and women, but also of trans men and women, of people who are non-binary, and any other sexual orientation and gender identity is essential to understanding how genocide occurs, understanding how to prosecute it, and understanding how to prevent understanding how to prevent it as well.
Thank you. Antoinette is wondering, would the kidnapping of young girls in Nigeria be considered a precursor to genocide?
That is a fascinating question. That is how GJC started our project, actually, on gender and genocide, specifically with the Chibok schoolgirls, I think, in 2015. There possibly, I mean, in any of it, it's certainly, I mean, it's you could argue it's a mass atrocity in and of itself, but it's certainly, I would think, a warning sign of I mean, it is a grave violation of human rights and a crime against humanity. The situation in the Nigerian context is, at least in the past, I haven't followed, like, I know that very recently there have been very prominent stories of kidnappings. I haven't followed it as closely in the past few months, but oftentimes what you were seeing back when GGC started the project in the coming years was that you would have the kidnappings, and then you would have the possession of those school children as a negotiating tool or as a leverage point in for the perpetrating group. In other words, you didn't have the kidnappings with the intent to destroy the group. And I didn't discuss that in the talk, which I thought about, but didn't. And the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part being the quintessential genocidal requirement. That's what sets genocide apart from crimes against humanity and war crimes. And so in the Nigerian context, you're missing, at least in the examples that I know, and that, again, I haven't been following in the past few months, but you're missing that intent to destroy. So it wouldn't fall within the indicia of a potential genocide, but it's certainly a crime against humanity, which gets to, I think, a very important point in the whole discourse of genocide, and that is the overprivileging. I mean, I was talking about the overprivileging of killing, leaving out gendered experiences of genocide, but there is in some ways an overprivileging of genocide as the crime of crimes, when crimes against humanity are really bad and just as bad in many contexts, and war crimes are very bad. So it sometimes feels as if something's not genocide, then okay, well, but that, you know, the international community should be just as active to prevent and punish crimes against humanity as it is genocide. And I think there are reasons for that, but I do think that there is an overprivileging of genocide in the international discourse on certain crimes. So in the Nigerian context, not necessarily the fifth act of genocide because we don't have the intent, but nevertheless a crime against humanity that needs to be accountability and needs to be responded to.
And how can transitional justice efforts consider the experiences of women and girls as witnesses, as you mentioned in your presentation, while also helping them heal from the trauma?
That's another. Your audience is very sophisticated and asks great questions. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that the starting place for transitional justice mechanisms has to be locally. It has to be with the victim population, and it has to be centered, be what in the women, peace, and security context we refer to as survivor-centered. And so I think that there are, depending on the situation, a wide variety of different mechanisms and modalities through which accountability arise, but there's also other. Well, I mean, the questioner would know this because it's a very good question, but there are symbolic form of reparation that are possible to capture certain experiences or to at least commemorate the crimes committed against the population, against the target group, against a portion of the target group. Of course, there are other forms of reparation. There are guarantees of non-repetition, that can be and should be included into a legal framework of a post-genocidal society that should specifically take into consideration the experiences of every member of the genocidal population, whether it's women or men or members of the Soji community. And so I think that the starting place for that is with, it's context specific, and the starting place is with the members of the target population. And I think, in some ways, adjudication and international prosecution, regardless of the venue, is some portion of that, which is where you see the participation of the people surviving the genocide as witnesses. But my point was more about the injustice that is brought about by simultaneously not acknowledging the crimes being committed against certain members of the target group as genocide, while also relying on those very same members to testify about the crimes occurring against other members. And so if you're going to adjudicate genocide at all, adjudicate genocide in its full tapestry, including all members of the target group, and don't overly privilege crimes committed against cisgender men and boys.
Thank you. Okay, so this next question is from David. He says, as you mentioned, women could experience a different type of violence, and it means they might survive and bear the memories of these atrocities in their future lives. As we probably know, genocide prosecution manages sometimes to account for only high politicians and generals, but not always common executioners that most of the time come back living just next door to the victims. How about reconciliation processes between survivors and oppressors and that trauma? Is there any turn in international law so far?
Another fascinating and great question, and very right to bring up. Absolutely. I think the best resource, a very helpful resource on this question, and I think on the previous question about bringing women and girls, and I would add people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, bringing them within the fold of transitional justice processes, particularly in the context of the Commission of Sexual and Gender-Based Violence. I'll forget the year, but I believe it was in 2014, UN Secretary General has a guidance note on reparations for violations of international humanitarian and war crimes, international humanitarian law and war crimes. There's also a subsequent guidance note on reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. And those documents, in particular, the guidance note on reparations for sexual and gender-based violence, talks about each of the 5 different types of reparation, whether it's rehabilitation or compensation or guarantees of non-repetition, and discusses how certain of those reparations regimes, how reparations regimes include all of them and should include all of them, but also how they can be animated in specific contexts. So I think that the question, reconciliation is an extremely important part of metabolizing and processing and a genocide, depending, within a particular community, and that I would. I'm sorry. Could you just repeat the second half of the question?
Yeah. How about reconciliation process between survivors and oppressors, trauma, and has there been any turn or change in international law so far?
Well, yeah, like I said, I think reconciliation as a mode of reparation, as one of the 5 modes of reparation, is a very important part of any transitional justice process, and should take into consideration the particular gender crimes and accommodate the particular gender crimes that occurred. And again, should be done in coherence and accordance with the particular aims and goals of the victim population. And in some contexts, we discussed the risks of honor killing as one of the genocidal acts. In some cases, a lot can be done in terms of reconciliation within the community, and in particular where you have people who were targeted for sexual and gender-based violence, and having that sexual and gender-based violence being symbolic of an attack on the community's honor, and there needing to be reconciliation of within the victim group in order to lift that stigma from the survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And I think the very prominent example of that was how the high religious authority of the Yazidis issued an edict for the welcoming and re-inclusion of members of the Yazidi community that had experienced sexual and gender-based violence. And the religious leadership in that context taking the role and responsibility to carry out some form of reconciliation within the group in order to help the community move on. And I think that is an important aspect of a gendered look of the experiences of survivors and the gender-based violence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you spoke a little bit about this in your presentation, but this next question is asking if you could discuss a little bit more about the way the gendered lens is left out of systems that can predict or monitor possible genocides.
Sure. So yeah, there are a few of systems that predict and monitor mass atrocity crimes and genocide, and overwhelmingly they focus on mass killing. They equivocate between mass atrocity and mass killing, and so according to those indices and rubrics, a mass atrocity isn't a crime unless it's mass killing. They don't even take into consideration, for instance, prevalence. Well, to the extent that they take into consideration prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence, it's sexual and gender-based violence as a predictor of potential mass killing, not as a crime in and of itself. And that, of course, is just woefully short. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are other important aspects as well that the international community is missing in being overly, in focusing so narrowly on mass killing. I think that one of their, Valerie Hudson, in her book, I think it's called Sex, War, and Peace, mm-hmm. includes the piece of research that says that the most reliable predictor of a society's likelihood to enter into international or non-international armed conflict is the prevalence of violence against women within the community. And so what you see is the more prevalent sexual and gender-based violence, the higher the likelihood that a community will enter periods of civil unrest or international conflict or war. And that's an extremely valuable predictor. Extremely valuable to know that the vulnerability of the population to gender-based violence and to sexual violence is a key and the most reliable indicator for devolution of the situation into civil unrest or conflict. Tells us something, and it tells us that we should be paying attention to levels of gender equality for overall stability within any particular context. But overwhelmingly, these frameworks and criteria don't do that, and instead are focused on on predicting episodes of mass killing. I can't remember the particular instrument and the particular predictive framework, and I don't want to say the wrong one because I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. But one of their criteria is the adherence of the state in question, the perpetrating state, to World Trade Organization agreements. Well, that's not, maybe that might be a valuable predictor, but let's also talk about the physical insecurity of women, girls, and members of the LGBTQ community, because that's equally as valid as WTO agreements.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Let's try to get to a few more questions. I know we have about 3 or 4 more, so we can maybe try to fit all of them in. How does the persecutory system consider women who have been victims, but who have also committed the acts of violence?
Yeah, that's an extremely complex and complicated question. The persecutory or the prosecutory system?
You're saying persecutory.
I don't know how to answer that. I think, though, that the question is very, it's astute to point out that, as you know, my talk is very much about women and girls, and again, to the previous question, people, and we should include people of diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, their experiences as victims of genocide, but they get very much are the perpetrators of genocide as well. And you have prominent cases coming out of Rwanda. In that, I know that there are certain members within these activists in the Yazidi community that are very focused on the prosecution of female members of ISIS as a part of the overall effort to justice. And I think that in many ways in the ISIS context, you're seeing a very gendered prosecutions play out, where you're having prosecutions for members like female wives of ISIS saying, no, I was forced to do this. I didn't have any agency. The conditions within the Syria or Iraq at the time were extremely violent, and if I had no ability to say anything that was against my ISIS fighter husband, or I would have been subjected to violence. And you have testimonies from the prosecution saying, well, no, there was, you didn't have to treat the Yazidi slave like this, or so forth. And you're seeing these differing roles that are imposed primarily on Yazidi or on women flesh out. Are you merely an agentless wife, or are you also a perpetrator of international crimes? And I think that dichotomy is not a helpful one, and that that we should resist breaking things down into that and have a more nuanced understanding of the many complicated ways that people live in, experience, perpetrate, and are victim to genocide.
Mm-hmm. And is the concept of crimes against humanity a more effective legal tool for protecting women and others than genocide? In recent decades, I believe, for example, the International Criminal Court has prosecuted more cases for CAH than genocide.
Yeah, that's certainly right. Well, you're right. You're right to point out there's been more successful prosecutions, certainly at the International Criminal Court, for crimes against humanity than there are for genocide. However, one of the reasons, I talked about this earlier, one of the reasons why I think there's a privileging of genocide in the international discourse is because the genocide has the Genocide Convention. And the Genocide Convention says that states have international legal responsibilities to prevent and punish genocide. So when a genocide occurs, and there's, I think, 142 some odd states to the Genocide Convention. So when a genocide occurs, or there's a risk of genocide occurring, all of those countries, all 140 countries, have obligations to do something to prevent genocide. And GGC argues you have to take a gendered approach to your obligation to prevent genocide, and you have to have an appreciation for the ways that gender informs how genocide, the lead up to genocide happens, and how genocide is perpetrated. Crimes Against Humanity doesn't have a treaty that says that. Arguably, there's a customary international obligation to prevent and punish crimes against humanity, but it's not a convention. You can't point to it in the UN treaty database and say, look, there's the black letter law that says that. there's a draft one. There's a lot of advocacy and activity at the moment trying to get one. But there isn't one yet. And so I think it's a complex question because to some extent, crimes against humanity are more successfully prosecuted, but are prosecutions valuable deterrents to crimes against humanity? I think that's a question. Is having a convention meaningful deterrents to commission of genocide? I think that's sometimes a question, but the reason that there's so much focus on genocide, I think, is because you have this surrounding legal framework about the prevention and punishment.
And last question today. Emily is saying, at the risk of being repetitive, another question on transitional justice. So after genocide, how can traditional punitive legal procedures work together with customary law and cultural norms to create a unique transitional justice process that helps the victims and survivors overcome their trauma and receive justice and accountability? And if you know who or what institutions would lead to implement these kind of processes.
Just a minor one for the last. Yeah. Thank you, Emily, for the question. Again, I think that the answer has to be context specific. The situation for survivors of the Yazidi genocide is different than the situation for the survivors of the Rohingya genocide, and is different than the situation for Tigrayan women at the moment, or for Uyghur women at the moment. And I think that any transitional justice efforts have to take into consideration those specific factors that are faced by members of that community, and most notably, the specific gendered ways in which the genocide is persecuted. So, I went through the specific ways that gender might inform certain of the genocidal acts, but not all of those happen in every single genocide. You might not have separation of children, or you might not even have killing. And there's a question about that within legal scholars, but you might not have every single genocidal act. And so the transitional justice projects need to reflect the genocidal acts, the mode of intent to destroy. There's two types of intent to destroy. There's intent to physically destroy, which is like exterminate, and there's intent to biologically destroy, which is essentially ending the group's regeneration. And what the predominant or prevailing, or what the balance is between those in a particular genocide should inform any transitional justice processes moving forward. So, I'm reluctant to have a blanket answer because, frankly, I don't know. I think that that the anchorage comes from the particular elements at play, both in the genocide more generally, in the social, historical, cultural, political factors at play within a particular context, but also, and importantly, within the prevailing gender norms within a context, and using, in theory, and hopefully, transitional justice processes to eradicate and chip away at some of the misogynistic attitudes that were prevailing within the perpetrators community in order to create a more gender equal setting after the fact and as a result of the transitional justice process.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Grant, for such an engaging presentation. We had some great questions today as well, so thank you so much for our participants. If you missed any part of today's session, we have recorded it and it will be available on our website, and will also circulate to those who have registered for today's session. And I also wanted to use this opportunity to bring to everyone's attention the Institute's annual Genocide and Human Rights University program, due to COVID, won't be happening in person this summer at the University of Toronto, but we are hosting it virtually online. So we do encourage you to look into this and to apply. It's a 2-week program. It's interdisciplinary and comparative in nature, taught by some of the leading scholars in the field who explore the fundamental themes related to genocide, along with specific case studies as well. So to learn how to apply and to learn more about the program, you can visit genocidestudies.org. So thank you so much, Grant. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Of course, thank you to Megan, and thank you to Jennifer and everyone at the Zoryan Institute, and I really had a great time.
Thank you, I did too. Take care, everyone. Bye.